The contemporary seeker confronts an insidious paradox. In an age saturated with information, wisdom has become scarce. In an era obsessed with external transformation, the interior landscape remains unmapped, unexplored, and fundamentally misunderstood. The alchemical triad, salt, sulfur, and mercury, presents not merely a chemical curiosity from medieval laboratories, but a philosophical framework of extraordinary precision for understanding the architecture of human consciousness itself. This is the problem that haunts the modern mind. How does one reconcile the fragmented self into a unified conscious whole? The doctrine of the three principles emerges from a specific intellectual genealogy. Paracelsus von Hohenheim, the 16th century physician-philosopher, systematized what had been implicit in earlier Hermetic texts, that all manifest reality expresses itself through three fundamental modes of existence. Where the four elements of classical philosophy described physical states, Paracelsus insisted that salt, sulfur, and mercury represented something deeper, the essential qualities or tria prima through which the anima mundi, the world soul, articulates itself in matter. This was not crude materialism. Paracelsus understood these principles as simultaneously physical and metaphysical, operating across every stratum of being from mineral to human to divine. The genealogy extends backward through Islamic alchemy, particularly Jabir ibn Hayyan, who had already intuited the necessity of triadic principles in natural philosophy. It reaches further still to Hermes Trismegistus, that mythical convergence of Egyptian Thoth and Greek Hermes, whose emerald tablet proclaimed, as above, so below, the fundamental Hermetic axiom that macrocosm and microcosm mirror one another in perfect correspondence. The three principles, properly understood, apply universally to metals in the crucible, to plants in the soil, and, most critically, to the human psyche in its struggle toward individuation. The premise that the Hermetic school establishes as axiomatic is this: the true laboratory is consciousness itself. The alchemist's apparatus, the athanor, the alembic, the pelican, these are externalized symbols of interior processes. When Paracelsus spoke of salt as the principle of fixity and materialization, sulfur as the principle of combustibility and transformation, and mercury as the principle of volatility and mediation, he was describing fundamental operations of the psyche. The great work, the Magnum Opus, is not the production of metallic gold, but the refinement of consciousness into an integrated, autonomous, and spiritually awakened state. This is the secret that sensationalist occultism consistently obscures. The treasure is internal, psychological, and demands rigorous self-confrontation. The three principles constitute a dynamic system, not a static taxonomy. Salt represents the principle of embodiment, structure, and material persistence. It is what remains when volatile elements are driven off, the residuum, the skeleton, the container. In human terms, salt corresponds to the body itself, to habitual patterns, to the accumulated weight of personal history and biological inheritance. Salt is memory crystallized into form, the sediment of experience that gives continuity to identity across time. Sulfur, by contrast, embodies the principle of animation, desire, and transformative fire. Where salt is passive and receptive, sulfur is active and expansive. In medieval alchemical texts, sulfur was associated with the soul, not in any vague religious sense, but as that faculty which desires, which reaches toward goals, which burns with passion or ambition or spiritual longing. Psychologically, sulfur manifests as the emotional volitional dimension of consciousness, the drives, affects, and desires that propel the individual toward or away from objects in the world. Mercury occupies the position of mediator between these poles. Neither purely fixed nor purely volatile, Mercury represents the principle of communication, translation, and transformation between different orders of being. The alchemists observed that metallic mercury was simultaneously liquid and metallic, that it dissolved gold, and yet was itself uncapturable. In the human being, mercury corresponds to mind, to consciousness itself, as that faculty which can observe both body and emotion, which can reflect upon itself, which can move between the material and the spiritual domains. Mercury is the psychopomp of the psyche, the messenger that carries information between different levels of selfhood. The brilliance of this system emerges in its interconnections. Salt without sulfur is inert matter, dead form without animating principle. Sulfur without salt is destructive fire, pure desire without grounding or direction. Mercury without the other two is empty abstraction, thought divorced from embodiment and feeling. Health, psychological, spiritual, or physical, requires dynamic equilibrium among all three. Disease, correspondingly, manifests as dominance of one principle at the expense of the others, or as corruption within a single principle. This triadic structure resonates profoundly with other esoteric systems. The Kabbalistic tree of life organizes itself around three pillars: severity, mercy, and equilibrium, which map precisely onto salt, sulfur, and mercury, respectively. The three pillars are not isolated but interpenetrating, with each sephira participating in the dynamic flow between fixity and expansion. Similarly, Neoplatonism's triad of the One, Nous, and Soul articulates the same fundamental pattern: absolute unity, salt, intellective life, mercury, and animating principle, sulfur. The Rosicrucian tradition, synthesizing Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and Christian mysticism, understood the three principles as stages of spiritual initiation. The body must be purified, salt; the soul must be inflamed, sulfur; and the spirit must be liberated, mercury. The mentality required of the true adept is demanding in the extreme. It requires what Aleister Crowley termed magical will, not mere wishful thinking or superficial desire, but the concentrated, unified intention of the entire being directed toward a single aim. The alchemical work demands intellectual rigor, sufficient to distinguish true principles from their counterfeits, emotional honesty capable of confronting the most disturbing contents of the psyche, and ethical commitment to the transformation of self rather than manipulation of others. The occultist ethic, properly understood, rejects both dogmatic moralism and amoral relativism. It recognizes that consciousness exists within a lawful cosmos, that certain actions strengthen integration while others fragment it, that spiritual development imposes responsibilities proportionate to the powers it awakens. Finally, the adept must cultivate what one might term sacred skepticism, the willingness to doubt one's own interpretations, to test experiences against multiple frameworks, to acknowledge that symbolic truth operates differently than literal truth, and that self-deception is the occupational hazard of all interior work. The path demands nothing less than complete intellectual honesty, combined with ruthless self-examination. The alchemical process, mapped onto psychological development, unfolds through a series of operations that transform consciousness from its initial crude state into refined integration. While various alchemical texts enumerate different numbers of operations, the essential sequence moves through dissolution of rigid structures, purification of contaminated elements, and reconstitution at a higher level of organization. Each operation corresponds to specific psychological work, and each must be accomplished thoroughly before the next can genuinely begin. The work commences with calcination, the application of intense fire to reduce substances to ash. Psychologically, this represents the burning away of ego identifications, the reduction of inflated self-concepts to their essential components. The salt principle, rigid habit patterns, defensive structures, the accumulated persona, must be subjected to the sulfur principle's transformative heat. This is not comfortable work. The individual experiences this as crisis. The cherished self-image reveals itself as construct rather than reality. Comfortable assumptions about one's character prove illusory, and the props supporting psychological security collapse. Jung termed this ego death, but the alchemical image is more precise. The false self must be reduced to ash so that its essential salt, what is truly substantial, can be recovered from what was merely dross. From ash, the work moves to dissolution, wherein the calcined remains are dissolved in water or other solvents. If calcination employs fire, dissolution employs its opposite, the flowing, boundary-eroding, emotionally saturated realm of water. Here, the rigid structures broken by fire are further loosened, made fluid, returned to an undifferentiated state. Psychologically, this corresponds to the flooding of consciousness with previously repressed or unconscious contents. Emotions long denied surge forward. Memories return. The clear boundaries between I and not I become permeable. The Mercury principle, consciousness itself, must learn to maintain integrity while allowing itself to be temporarily overwhelmed by the waters of the unconscious. This stage manifests as overwhelming anxiety, grief, or confusion. The individual may experience what clinicians would diagnose as depression or dissociation, but the alchemist understands this dissolution as necessary. The false structures of ego must be liquefied before genuine reorganization becomes possible. The danger lies in drowning, in losing all structure and succumbing to psychosis or catatonia. The art consists in dissolving rigidity without destroying cohesion entirely. Separation follows as the crucial discriminative operation. When all is fluid chaos, the adept must learn to distinguish essence from accident, valuable from worthless, pure from contaminated. The dissolved solution separates into layers, subtle above, gross below. Psychologically, this represents the development of what Jung called the observing ego, that capacity of consciousness to witness its own processes without identifying with them completely. Here the Mercury principle fully emerges as psychopomp. The adept learns to identify. This emotion is rage originating from childhood trauma. This thought pattern is internalized parental criticism. This desire is authentic longing versus this other is mere reactive compensation. Separation requires brutal honesty and sophisticated discrimination. It is the stage at which many fail, for it demands acknowledging aspects of oneself that violate cherished self-conceptions. The shadow, Jung's term for those qualities the ego has denied and projected outward, must be recognized as belonging to the self. The alchemical image is of separating subtle mercury from gross matter, but the psychological reality is separating what is genuinely one's own from what has been introjected, conditioned, or externally imposed. Conjunction represents the first significant synthesis. Having separated pure from impure, the adept now consciously recombines selected elements in new relationship. The purified salt, body, habit, material existence, is united with purified sulfur, desire, will, animating force, through the mediation of conscious mercury, discriminating awareness. Psychologically, this manifests as the integration of previously split-off aspects of self. The shadow qualities acknowledged in separation are now integrated rather than merely recognized. Jung described this as the integration of the anima or animus, the contrasexual archetype that represents those qualities the ego has assigned to other. In alchemical imagery, this appears as the conjunctio oppositorum, the marriage of sun and moon, king and queen, gold and silver. The experience is often numinous. The individual feels for the first time genuinely unified, capable of holding contradictions without fragmentation, able to be both strong and vulnerable, assertive and receptive, rational and emotional. But this is merely the first synthesis, not the final goal. Fermentation introduces a new energy into the synthesized compound. In practical alchemy, fermentation involves introducing a fermenting agent to produce transformation through decomposition and regeneration. Psychologically, this stage corresponds to the introduction of genuinely spiritual or transpersonal contents into consciousness. Having integrated the personal psyche, the individual now becomes open to what lies beyond the personal. Archetypal energies, spiritual experiences, genuine encounters with what religious traditions call the divine, or what Jung termed the self with a capital S. This is not comfortable enlightenment. Fermentation involves renewed breakdown. The carefully achieved conjunction must be fermented, broken down again, but now at a higher level. The individual experiences this as spiritual crisis, or what mystical literature calls the dark night of the soul. The ego, having achieved considerable integration, must now surrender its sovereignty to something greater than itself. The carefully constructed self must die again, but this death is different from the initial ego death of calcination. Now, it is not the false self that dies, but the autonomous ego itself, which must accept its role as servant rather than master of the psyche. Distillation purifies the fermented matter by repeated heating and condensing, separating increasingly subtle fractions. Psychologically, this represents the refinement of spiritual understanding through repeated cycles of experience, reflection, and integration. Insights achieved in fermentation must be tested, applied, refined through living. The individual moves through repeated cycles of expansion and contraction, insight and confusion, connection and separation. Each cycle distills the essence more purely, removes more dross, clarifies understanding more precisely. This is the stage of genuine spiritual discipline: meditation, contemplation, rigorous self-examination, ethical refinement. The practitioner develops what esoteric traditions call discrimination or discernment, the capacity to distinguish genuine spiritual experience from psychological inflation, authentic intuition from wishful thinking, true guidance from ego-driven fantasy. The Mercury principle reaches its highest development. Consciousness becomes increasingly transparent to itself, capable of observing its own operations with minimal distortion. Finally, coagulation represents the ultimate synthesis, the fixing of the volatile, the embodiment of spirit in matter, the production of the philosopher's stone. In psychological terms, this is Jung's individuation completed, the self-realized, integrated, and capable of functioning in the world with full consciousness. The three principles achieve perfect equilibrium. Salt, the embodied material existence, is no longer gross matter, but transfigured substance, the subtle body of esoteric traditions. Sulfur, will and desire, is no longer compulsive or reactive, but aligned with the self's purpose. Mercury, consciousness, is no longer partial or fragmented, but unified, transparent, and capable of moving freely between material and spiritual domains. The coagulated stone is not otherworldly transcendence, but rather full presence, the capacity to be entirely embodied, entirely conscious, and entirely alive simultaneously. The adept at this stage manifests what various traditions call different names: the true self, the divine human, the philosopher. But the essential quality is integration, autonomy, and what one might term conscious immortality, not in the sense of bodily persistence, but as identification with the transpersonal self that transcends individual mortality. The most critical juncture in the alchemical work corresponds to what medieval texts termed the Nigredo, the blackening, the stage of putrefaction and death. This maps most directly onto the fermentation stage previously described, but its significance demands separate treatment. For it is here that the greatest number of aspirants fail, and it is here that the distinction between genuine spiritual crisis and psychological pathology becomes most fraught. The Nigredo announces itself phenomenologically as complete dissolution of meaning. The individual has progressed through earlier stages, achieved significant integration, perhaps even experienced moments of genuine spiritual insight. Then, without warning or apparent cause, everything collapses. Previous certainties reveal themselves as illusions, achieved integration fragments. The sense of purpose that animated the work evaporates. What remains is not merely doubt, but a more devastating state: the utter absence of ground, the experience that nothing whatsoever can be relied upon, that existence itself is fundamentally empty of inherent meaning or value. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may present similar symptoms. Depression typically involves a narrowing of consciousness, a collapse into negative self-regard, a loss of vital energy. The Nigredo, by contrast, involves an expansion of consciousness that exceeds the ego's capacity to contain it. The individual sees too much, understands too completely the constructed nature of all meaning systems, all values, all purposes. The false security of unexamined assumptions has been destroyed, but no genuine ground has yet been established. One hangs suspended over an abyss of meaninglessness, and the existential vertigo is overwhelming. Alchemical texts describe this stage with images of decomposition, of the body putrefying in the tomb, of ravens devouring corpses, of blackness deeper than any night. Jung, analyzing these images psychologically, understood the Nigredo as the moment when the ego confronts its own death, not metaphorically, but experientially. The carefully maintained fiction of autonomous selfhood collapses. The ego discovers itself to be not the author of consciousness, but merely a content within it, not the master of the psyche, but one agency among many, and not even the most powerful. The terror of this realization cannot be overstated. Western culture constructs identity around ego sovereignty, around the assumption that I am a unified agent capable of rational self-direction. The Nigredo demolishes this assumption utterly. The individual experiences radical passivity, the sense of being lived by forces beyond conscious control. Dreams become invasive, overwhelming. Synchronicities multiply to the point of suggesting either cosmic significance or incipient psychosis. The boundary between inner and outer dissolves. One becomes porous to the unconscious, flooded by archetypal contents too powerful for the ego to assimilate. What distinguishes this state from pathology is its teleological nature. It serves a purpose within the larger process of individuation. Pathological psychosis involves fragmentation without reintegration, a breakdown that leads only to further breakdown. The Nigredo, by contrast, is a dissolution in service of subsequent synthesis. It is the necessary death that precedes rebirth, the emptying that makes space for new contents, the destruction of false ground that compels discovery of genuine foundation. The philosophical distinction centers on meaning and direction. In pathology, suffering is senseless, symptomatic, requiring therapeutic intervention to restore previous functioning. In the Nigredo, suffering is meaningful precisely because it shatters previous functioning that was itself pathological, the ego's tyrannical insistence on its own centrality. The dark night serves to dethrone the ego, not to destroy consciousness, but to reorganize it around a deeper center. The self in Jung's terminology, the Atman in Vedantic philosophy, the Christ within in Christian mysticism. Yet the distinction, while philosophically clear, is experientially ambiguous. The person enduring the Nigredo cannot know with certainty whether they are undergoing spiritual transformation or suffering psychological breakdown. This uncertainty is itself part of the trial. Faith, understood not as belief in doctrines but as commitment to the process despite absence of guarantees, becomes the only possible stance. One must continue the work without knowing whether it leads to integration or madness. The ethical dimension of this stage is crucial. The Nigredo produces profound temptations to escape through suicide, to numb through addiction, to regress into earlier, simpler states of consciousness, or perhaps most dangerously, to inflate into grandiose identification with archetypal contents. The ego, stripped of its defenses, may compensate by identifying with the very powers that threaten to overwhelm it, proclaiming itself a messiah or prophet or magus of cosmic significance. This is spiritual emergency collapsing into spiritual inflation, a failure as complete as despair merely inverted. The alchemical texts insist on the necessity of the vas bein clausum, the well-sealed vessel. Psychologically, this represents the capacity to contain overwhelming contents without either acting them out or being destroyed by them. One must endure the Nigredo, remain within the process, resist all temptations toward escape or inflation, and trust that the putrefaction serves a purpose even when no purpose is apparent. This requires a quality that esoteric traditions cultivate carefully: the capacity to bear tension, to hold opposites in consciousness simultaneously, to resist premature synthesis or resolution. The role of the guide or mentor becomes critical here. The alchemist does not work in isolation, but within a lineage, with teachers who have survived their own Nigredo and can therefore recognize the signs of genuine transformation versus pathological breakdown. The guide provides what the aspirant cannot provide for themselves: external perspective, certainty grounded in experience, and most fundamentally, the lived proof that the process can be survived and that the blackness does eventually give way to renewed light. The telos of the alchemical work, the goal toward which all previous operations direct themselves, is the production of what the texts call the philosopher's stone, the lapis philosophorum. But this stone is not object. It is subject, or more precisely, it is the reconciliation of subject and object within unified consciousness. It is the state Jung termed Individuation completed. The self realized, integrated, and capable of functioning with full awareness in the world of material existence while simultaneously maintaining connection to transpersonal realities. The individual who has completed the work, or rather, who has achieved sufficient integration that further work proceeds from stable ground, manifests certain unmistakable qualities. First, there is a quality of presence that others recognize immediately, even if they cannot articulate what they recognize. This is not charisma in the superficial sense of attractive personality, but something deeper, the sense that this person is entirely here, entirely embodied, entirely conscious in each moment. There is no dissociation, no splitting off of awareness into fantasy or distraction, but rather complete inhabitation of present experience. Second, the integrated individual demonstrates what might be called psychological sovereignty, not autocratic control, but autonomous self-governance. The compulsions, reactive patterns, and unconscious complexes that drive most human behavior have been made conscious and integrated. The person acts from choice rather than conditioning, from center rather than periphery. This manifests practically as the capacity to respond appropriately to situations rather than merely react habitually, to choose consciously rather than be driven unconsciously, to take responsibility for one's effects upon the world rather than project causality outward. Third, and perhaps most significant, is the development of what esoteric traditions term conscious immortality. This does not mean the naive belief that the physical body will not die. Rather, it means that identification has shifted from the mortal ego to the immortal self, that aspect of consciousness that transcends individual existence, that participates in archetypal and transpersonal realities, that belongs to what various traditions call the eternal, the absolute, the divine. The fear of death diminishes not through denial, but through direct knowledge of that within which does not die, because it was never merely personal. The ethical implications of this transformation are profound. The integrated individual discovers that genuine self-interest and universal compassion coincide. When the ego no longer dominates consciousness, when one experiences oneself as manifestation of transpersonal self, the artificial boundary between self and other becomes porous. One cannot harm another without simultaneously harming oneself, cannot benefit oneself except by benefiting the larger whole of which one is part. This is not moral obligation imposed from without, but ethical recognition arising spontaneously from expanded consciousness. Yet this awareness does not produce passive universalism or sentimental benevolence. The integrated individual remains capable of discrimination, judgment, and, when necessary, opposition to that which genuinely threatens integrity. The difference is that such actions arise from clarity rather than confusion, from love rather than fear, from commitment to the good rather than reactive defense of ego interests. The alchemical salt, the principle of fixity, has been refined into what one might term principled stability, the capacity to maintain one's ground without rigidity, to be firm without being brittle. The practical application of this integration to modern existence involves what we might call conscious participation in the world. The integrated individual does not withdraw into mystical isolation, but rather engages more deeply with material reality precisely because they are no longer merely identified with it. Work becomes not mere labor for survival, but conscious service. Relationships become not strategies for need fulfillment, but authentic encounters between sovereign beings. Political engagement becomes not ideological warfare, but commitment to genuine justice and collective well-being. Every domain of existence is transformed when consciousness itself is transformed. The responsibility that accompanies this integration cannot be overstated. To achieve genuine individuation is to become accountable not merely for one's own development, but for the collective evolution of consciousness itself. Jung was explicit on this point. The individuated person becomes a teacher, guide, or elder, not necessarily through formal role, but through the simple fact of their existence as living demonstration of consciousness integrated. They have traversed the territory that others must traverse, and their presence serves as beacon, warning, and encouragement for those who follow. This is why the Hermetic school insists on rigor, on authentic confrontation rather than consoling fantasy, on philosophical depth rather than superficial technique. The stakes are precisely this high. The work is not personal therapy aimed at mere adjustment, though it includes that. It is not spiritual experience pursued for its own sake, though it involves that. It is the conscious participation in the evolution of consciousness itself, the deliberate refinement of human awareness toward its highest potential. To approach this work casually or as entertainment is not merely insufficient, it is dangerous, for partial awakening can produce inflation and spiritual pathology more destructive than unconsciousness itself. The completion of the work, therefore, is simultaneously an ending and a beginning. The major operations have been accomplished, the three principles brought into equilibrium, the integration achieved. But this state must now be maintained, deepened, and expressed through engagement with existence. The stone, once produced, becomes not a possession to be hoarded, but an active principle, a lapis vivus or living stone that continues to transform both the individual and, through them, the world they inhabit. The work never ends. It merely transitions from transformation to manifestation, from becoming to being, from operation to presence. The architecture of human consciousness reveals itself upon sufficient investigation to be neither accidental nor arbitrary, but to reflect the structure of reality itself. Salt, sulfur, and mercury, body, soul, and spirit, matter, energy, and consciousness, fixity, transformation, and mediation, these are not metaphors, but precise descriptions of how existence organizes itself at every level of manifestation. To understand this system intellectually is the beginning of wisdom. To apply it practically through rigorous interior work is the path to genuine transformation. To complete the work is to become living demonstration of consciousness awakened to its own nature and capable of conscious participation in the cosmos. But the path demands everything. It demands intellectual rigor sufficient to distinguish truth from comfortable illusion, emotional honesty capable of confronting the most disturbing contents of the psyche, ethical commitment to transformation of self rather than manipulation of others, and the courage to endure dissolution without certainty of reintegration. It demands, finally, the recognition that the secret you seek is not hidden in ancient texts or exotic practices, but burns at the core of your own being, waiting only for sufficient discipline and devotion to be revealed. The gold you seek is not in the crucible but in the will that ignites the fire.